welcome to our special one-off podcast for International Women's Day 2023. My name is Chantal Herbert and I'm the founder of Sister Shack. I'm also an audio producer, black rights activist, DJ and events organiser. Joining me on this audio panel is tropical ecologist Dr Laura Braunhoultz, economics lecturer Dr Jinrui Pan, and consultant, coach and trainer Dr Julie Scanlon. The loose theme of this audio panel discussion is LGBTQIA plus women in STEM. We'll be discussing roles, gender identity, gender pay gaps, addressing the gender politics in STEM spaces, and our own experiences and achievements. We hope that you enjoy this discussion.
Hi, great to be with you, Chantal. So I'm Julie Scanlon and I am founder and director of my own consultancy business called Julie Scanlon Consultancy Limited. And I offer training and consultancy around diversity and inclusion, particularly around women and LGBT people. And I'm an executive coach.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jinrui Pan, and I'm a lecturer at Durham University. I'm a lecturer in behavior economics.
Hi, great to be here. Yeah, my name is Laura Braunhoultz. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Newcastle University. My background's tropical ecology and conservation.
Julie, I'll start with you, since you were first to introduce yourself. Why is gender equality important to you and sort of what is it to you?
That's a really big question.
Yes.
Gender equality to me is just a core element of social justice, where everyone can be fulfilled, has the opportunity to contribute to the social world and the economic world and the emotional and intellectual world, regardless of their gender or their, how they identify themselves in any kind of respect, actually. So I think it's vital so that we have an inclusive social space and sort of global world, basically.
And what does it mean to you in your work?
In my work, it means educating and fighting for that kind of social justice level. So I work now around ensuring organisations are inclusive with regard to all characteristics, but particularly gender, which is where I used to have a career as an academic prior to setting up my own consultancy. And that was one of the areas that I specialised in. And when I've come out of the academic world, it's been around really making sure that we have those women role models that we know are so important that that younger people and that all of us, in fact, can see in front of us. So it's around helping organisations to be inclusive, to understand what it is to be inclusive and kind of how to do that as well.
And Jin, why is it important to you, especially in your work, if it is at all?
Well, in my work, the economics department, historically, it is already a male-dominant department. So if we want to encourage more female to be in this field and this gender equality, it needs to be resolved. And then when I think about my understanding of gender equality, I don't think that women, it doesn't not necessarily mean that women or men should be treated the same, because you cannot expect women with maternity leave and have 2 children and have the same research output as a man. But then at the same time, these things need to be taken into consideration. So when it comes to opportunity and responsibility and promotion, etc., this aspect of women, difference between women and men, needs to be taken into consideration so women are not disadvantaged.
And it's interesting to me as well, because, when we think of traditional roles of ideas of parenting and who has children, we have trans men that can have children as well. And I think that leading the way in getting women these rights to have maternity pay will lead the door open to actually thinking about other gender identities as well, which, is something that we're in the sort of dawn of like a new idea around that. Yeah. And I think, when we take women along in that gender equality conversation, it definitely makes everything else more diverse.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if any of you will agree with that. So I haven't got to Laura yet, but I don't know if you would agree with that, Julie.
Absolutely, Chantal. And it's becoming better practice to call things like what we used to call maternity leave parental leave, which also brings about the fact that, fathers might like to take some leave when their children are born as well. Still, a lot of policies and kind of languages around kind of maternal and the expectation that it will be a very conventional setup. But we are moving towards, I think, more recognition that we need to be open around particularly something like parental responsibilities and who might be that parent who is looking after the child.
Exactly. And not just who's birthing the child, but actually who is looking after the child, who's raising the child as well.
Yeah.
But Laura, in your work, what does gender equality sort of mean to you, and why is it important?
So I guess a lot of my work focuses on dealing with some of the big environmental challenges, and they've typically been sort of researched and addressed from quite a male and quite a white male perspective. And I think, like, just in terms of tackling local and global challenges, we really need to have more of a diversity of voices in order to find those solutions. So for me, that's one of the big important things in seeing greater gender equality. Yeah.
Is it something that you have seen any changes at all, or is it still a really big battle? Has there even been a little tiny bit of change?
I mean, to be honest with you, my background, like in zoology and ecology, are actually quite there's quite a lot of women even historically in those roles, but what you tend to see is that classic sort of filtering of the amount of women as you move towards more like higher roles, more professorial and higher in the sort of academic ladder. And I think that is beginning to change. So that's a positive thing. But there's definitely a lot of the work that I do involves field work, and there's definitely a higher drop-off rate for women for a variety of reasons. I mean, some of it's sort of safety and the risks that women have to go through when they're taking on those kind of roles, and then some of it is, as has been already touched upon, like the parental responsibilities largely falling upon women still. So yeah, there's been some change, but there's still a long way to go.
Okay, thank you. I had a question which is probably going off a bit of what I'd previously said we were going to talk about. In terms of our LGBTQIA identity, where does that sit in terms of gender equality and what you do in your role? I'll ask that to Julie, because you do a lot of around LGBTQIA education.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it sits really centrally for me in that we don't treat the category of women as all women are the same, or women have the same experiences, and yet we have to bring in the concept of intersectionality, and one of those parts of that intersection could be your sexual orientation or how you express or experience your gender. And I think that just needs to be just absolutely central in there, in the same way that we would think about disability, or the same way that we would be thinking about race and ethnicity, to recognize that gender equality isn't, that woman isn't one all-embracing category and everyone has the same experiences and the same opportunities about it. So it absolutely needs to be figured in when we're thinking about the different kind of varieties that we can get within our communities and what those experiences can bring to the equation.
And we've previously discussed your work and what you do around that. Can you just explain what you do around sort of LGBTQIA plus?
Sure.
Education?
Yep, sure. It's mostly kind of consultancy or training work that I do in that area. So it might be going into organizations that could be anything from big corporates through to small charities and public sector. And I still do quite a lot of work with the higher education sector, seeing as that's been my background for a long time. So a lot of it will be training and awareness raising still at this stage. People are not very clued up still. If those of us that are kind of within these communities and kind of read and keep ourselves up to date, I feel sometimes we can feel that there's a level of understanding out there which just doesn't exist sometimes. So, the literal kind of Josephine Smith on the street still needs a lot of really kind of entry level talking and conversations to help them understand who people might be and why this stuff is important. So some of it is what we might think still as really quite elementary level, I think, sometimes, unfortunately.
That must be like really interesting to see, because your world will be so different to your education world.
Yeah,
that people just don't actually have any clue at all.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And my world is so different from when I was in higher education. Absolutely. And I just remember being at one event where twice I got asked, and it was sort of for small business owners, this event, and twice I got asked what LGBT was. And I don't mean just like what the letters mean, but literally they had never heard the acronym at all. So when I said I worked around diversity and inclusion, especially this and, and literally twice in that event in half a day, I got asked what it was. So it's a really extraordinary situation from where I moved from within HE, where at least people will know what some of these letters mean.
You would think
you'll note I wasn't using anything further than LGBT, because this is why I actually still stick with that, because initially, before we then move into the other spaces.
Just give them what they can handle.
Yeah, exactly.
Entry level.
Sadly.
Start small.
I know.
Work your way up.
101.
I'm going to ask Jen, if you're there, Jen, still.
Yeah.
Have you noticed a gender pay gap within your area of work?
Well, yeah, that's what we're currently striking for. One of the the academic UCU is the pay gap, the gender pay gap. But even the most recent, like 2019, it was still like standing like 15% pay gap. But there is the funny thing is, like, when I got my job, and then there's of course this is my own story, and also I don't know how representative it is. I just didn't know that I can or allowed to negotiate my pay. I was so happy just to get a job. But then my equal male colleague, who we went through the same interview, we had the same publication, and he was like, "Well, did you negotiate your pay?" And I was like, "Oh, I didn't even know that was a thing." And then I went on Google, and then it was like 70% of women less, 70% less in women they would negotiate the pay. And of course, this goes back to historical patriarchy or whole society. But of course, the pay gap is there. And what's more interesting is that when I actually on the job and then trying to negotiate my workload at that point, and I talked to a few women in the department, and then they all complain about higher workload comparing with the equal male colleagues. But then when I raised this to head of the department, they were like, well, if you don't fight or something, like he made a joke about it, like as in, like, if you just take it, then it's an internal bias, like about the gender, like basically saying, well, women are quiet, they don't complain, therefore they get higher workload. It's almost that kind of a joke, which says a lot by itself.
So the ownership is on the person and not on the system.
Not on the system at all. It just, I did find that even the whole process of negotiating workload is that I feel like I wasn't heard, because I talked to other male colleagues, when they say no to a particular teaching, that was it. But when I said no, they said, okay, and then come back, and then like still allocated to me. It was like, how did that happen?
Oh, so you mean that they didn't listen to you? That's
No.
shocking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Shock horror.
Yeah.
Laura, I'm going to ask you this actually, because you've recently got a new job and we talked about pay negotiation, which was interesting to hear what Jin has just said.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Yeah, so I'm still pretty early on in my career, so I haven't really noticed much of a pay gap, but between genders. But anecdotally, I am aware of a male colleague, well, ex-colleague, who was starting off as a postdoc and who negotiated his pay, which was then found out about by some female colleagues who had been in their roles longer and were getting less. And I think, you know, I don't know really what that's just one example, and I don't know whether that comes down to sort of expectations and I don't know, maybe more acceptance and just willingness to take whatever you're given, and maybe there's men are happier to ask for more than women are. But yeah, and another thing that Jin was talking about there about sort of workloads. One thing that I've definitely noticed, even just being in as a PhD researcher, was the amount of sort of more pastoral workload that gets done by female academics, female PhD researchers, who will take more roles that are not paid or really recognized, but that sort of help support a nice working environment and that sort of thing.
Can you just explain what, just because some people might not know what pastoral means in this context?
Yeah, sure. So less of the sort of teaching, research things, more things that you know, organizing events to bring people together, maybe supporting colleagues emotionally or students emotionally. So a lot of the work that goes on kind of behind the scenes and maybe doesn't really get recognized and certainly doesn't get paid for, but it always seems to be, in my experience, a woman that will step up into that role rather than a man doing it.
Do you think it's expected that women will just take that role because it's the caregiver role?
Yeah, I think definitely there's a lot to be said for that. I think it is expectations and maybe even just recognizing that it needs to be done. Sometimes I think that men can be blissfully blind of the fact that work's even needed and going on, to be honest with you.
Well, I guess especially if we're talking about sort of cisgender men who are non-queer or just sort of sit within the margins of air quotes normality. It's not really their world and their need, because there's no kind of intersection there. It's just kind of like, well, and I'm not saying their life is easy, but it certainly is easier in climbing the ladder. So I suppose it'd be a case of, well, why they wouldn't even think about it because it's not their needs.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's I actually was listening to a piece from Women's Hour earlier today when they were talking about workplace relationships and that kind of thing. And one of the people in that discussion said something about that women tend to prefer having friends at work, whereas it doesn't seem to be an important thing for men. So I think that a lot of the role in like forming and nurturing and sort of bonds within a workplace fall onto women because it's important to them as well.
And do you have trouble negotiating pay? Even though you say you're relatively new to your work, but you have a lot of experience of field work and you have done a lot of that in your life. And I wouldn't say that you are at the beginning. I think maybe because you're a recent graduate, you're at the beginning, but actually you have a lot more experience than probably one of your colleagues in higher positions. So would you have trouble negotiating your pay?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I was recently in a position where I could have potentially done some negotiating of a wage and or my salary, and I just didn't feel comfortable. I definitely felt like Jin mentioned there about just feeling grateful to have the job, and that was even knowing the sort of previous experience that my male ex-colleague had gone through. So yeah, I don't know if it's a confidence thing or what, but I haven't yet negotiated salary, so.
Right then. I mean, yeah, I think it is a really hard thing to do, to put yourself up there, because you're worried about, will they go with somebody else, or will they just, if they say no, then you're kind of like, well, is it my fault that they've said no? Am I not good enough? It's taking I think a lot of us would probably internalize that as something that we're doing wrong and not the system, which is the problem again with sort of gender equality of, it puts the ownership on women and non-binary people and people that don't fit in the margins of like, oh, we're not good enough. But actually we are. It's just that the system in place is not good enough for us, or it doesn't work for us. Jin, I'm going to ask you, with the intersection of being a queer woman or a woman in LGBTQIA+, how has this impacted your work, if at all?
Well, it's kind of lonely. It's, I mean, as far as I know, I'm probably the only lesbian I mean, like, we already have very few women in the department. And as far as I know, I'm the only lesbian. So I don't really broadcast my sexuality at work, but it would come up because I'm also standing out as a single woman. No, I'm not married. So it did come up. But so what happened is that I don't know if it's sometimes I bring this up, as in subconsciously I want them to treat me not just like, that's also internal bias. I want to appear to be like, different, you can't mess with me, I know all this and stuff. But at the same time, I don't know, it kind of also makes me stand out, and then that gives me a certain unease. And also another thing is, like, I know I mentioned about being pregnant and being a motherhood, and then that thing, like, but when I sort of mentioned before, when I had a miscarriage, and I mentioned at work that I need a day leave, and then somehow it was like I got this feeling that they were a bit shocked that I'm actually proceeding to actually become pregnant and stuff. It was like, do you know what I mean? Like, there was a gap between my gay identity and being a mother. Some sort of, like, it need a second to connect, and that makes me feel like,
I know. I have had a child. I have a 13-year-old, as you know, and I have a child with a man. But I don't date men. I would probably say that my identity now would be lesbian. I don't know where I sit really, but I think I find it really uncomfortable explaining how I have a child in the first place. I almost feel like an imposter that I'm in the queer community and I have a child with a man, and I dated a man for a long time, and I don't know whether that's internal for me as well, like bias, but I find it very uncomfortable actually talking about it, and I know I shouldn't, because I've done it the way that people expect it, but then it's almost like they can't quite quantify that I date women, but I have like a child, or at least it feels that way. But I can't imagine what it would feel like to be trying to have a baby as someone, without a male figure there, and then sort of explaining it, and then having to be like, okay, well, I want some maternity leave, and they're like, well, why is a lesbian trying to have a baby? Like, what do you need a baby for? How do you have a baby? Do you find that idea of explaining yourself really hard to do?
Yeah, I mean, almost also, my field is also very male dominant. And then I realized from, like, quite early on in my career that I'm almost like using my gay identity to as a flag or as a shield, to protect me from any potential sexual harassment as well. Because I had experienced that, when I was a PhD student, that some professor just casually invite me back to his hotel room after a seminar. Things like that. I using that as a shield to do that, to almost like, you got to treat me like a man. Because I date women, which is already like, it's not correct, but that inside of my head, it's a shield. But then when I'm actually actively trying to become a mother, and then that also is almost like identity, kind of like they need a moment to engage that.
Yeah, and it must be, especially when you can kind of just go, well, I'm a lesbian, so I don't want to like go back to your hotel. But actually, it's like, this is really actually inappropriate, and you shouldn't be doing this to me. But
exactly, yes. I mean, I was only 22, 23, and I didn't have any like backbone at that point to tell a professor from LSE and just saying like, this is wrong. So my response was just like, oh, I'm gay. But he's like, oh, even better. It was just gross. It was gross. But after that experience, I sort of like kind of using this shield from miles away, just like, here we go. That's my rainbow. Stay clear.
And the fact that you can't even use that anywhere because it just turns them on even more.
Yeah, that's
it's a fetish now. It's the next level of fetishization. It's like, you're a Eastern Asian woman and you're a lesbian. This is like the best thing ever.
Yeah.
Julie, obviously you can use this useful in what you teach and what you teach, the education that you give. But when you were lecturing, was this something that impacted your work?
Yes, it did somewhat, even in what is supposedly a relatively open space. And it's just horrible to hear of your experiences, Jin. I just want to say thanks for sharing that and just how awful that was. But yeah, I did experience some of this, but not to that extent at all. And just having things kind of censored one time when a colleague and I were putting on a series about lesbians on screen, and we were putting some stuff on at the Star and Shadow Cinema, which is a local volunteer-run cinema for folk that are not around Newcastle. And we had put some posters up around our workplace. We were both at Northumbria Uni at the time, and the posters kept getting taken down. And there was, there was just something that people felt was clearly upsetting about having a screenings around, what lesbian representation looked like, even though it was, clearly a couple of academics that were doing this, and it wasn't anything particularly salacious. But it just gives you that connection, which actually links, unfortunately, to Jin's story, to Jin's experience of the connection with, like, there's something sexy or hot around it, and instead of it actually simply being us and who we are, our sexual orientations, and our stuff was being just gently censored by whomever, kind of within that university context. And actually, it's there was a big study that came out of the States which found that lesbians are more likely to be sexually harassed in the workplace than straight women, and bisexual women were at the peak of that. It was like bisexual women, then it was lesbians, and there's something around that awful experience that it's almost as though you're a kind of additional target, I suppose, and there's additional salaciousness around that, because our identity is kind of objectified, really, instead of us being treated equitably as simply being who we are.
And that's what we discuss a lot of that in the last podcast we did, didn't we? All around that, the idea of this, and well, not the idea, but of this, and the awfulness around that you can't even just exist in your identity without turning someone on even more. without even trying. It's like, well,
yeah, the people that you're not trying.
yeah,
but yeah, it's
not the ones you want.
No, that's right. It's a way of sort of co-opting us, keeping us in our place, and it's about power really, and who holds that power within the social world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what all of this comes down to, isn't it? It's power and gatekeeping, and also the fear as well. Like I think people are really fearful of like women and non-binary people and queer people being in the spotlight and just having equal rights. Like, it's like, oh, what will this do to me? Like, it's not going to do anything to you. Actually, it's really going to enrich your life.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like, why would you not want that? But yeah, it's just full fear and power.
It is. It's fear and power. And with the work that I do now, I'm on LinkedIn quite a lot, and I've had harassment on LinkedIn, like quite a lot of harassment on LinkedIn from, it's always one particular demographic.
I think I've seen one actually where a guy was, he said something.
So straight white men, and it happens more than it should. And it actually went offline and into my emails and became a hate crime was actually sort of recorded, because it got a bit nasty and I had to contact the police. And that's just to tap in, it's like that. What is that fear, and that's simply about me existing visibly as a lesbian, talking about some work I'm doing or whatever it is. And you've absolutely sort of what you've mentioned there is sort of we somehow need to be curtailed.
Yeah. Silenced, curtailed, or just be the good little woman. Just go back to just talk about nice things like dresses. Dresses and sewing. That's what we do, right, in our time off?
Apparently.
Certainly what I get up to anyway. Laura, hello. Have you had any experiences where you've noticed that you've been treated negatively due to, who you are, your gender identity or your queer identity?
I mean, yes and no. I've been fairly fortunate in a lot of my work, and I work within a research team who I can be myself. I don't have to sort of be cautious about any part of my identity and revealing that. So I feel very fortunate for that, definitely. But it is, especially, I mean, my identity as a woman, as a lesbian, my identity as a woman is very much out there. Everyone knows about it. But I'm able to sort of determine how I'm going to present myself in terms of being a lesbian. And I know that that's quite a privilege in many ways. And it's meant that I've, been able to work in places that I might not necessarily have been able to
But in this country, though, because you've experienced coming out of this country where you actually couldn't be yourself for several months.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived and worked in a country where homosexuality is still punishable by death. So in that regard, that was a pretty challenging scenario, just in terms of, constantly looking over my shoulder and worrying about sort of if any of my online presence was going to be detected or anything like that. I think as a white woman coming from the UK, probably I was way more safe than I felt I was, but there was definitely an element of fear that I've not experienced in the UK. But even fieldwork that I've done in the UK, there's definitely been times where I've just, it's not something that I'm willing to bring up because I know it will make me more vulnerable, just it's not as accepted in different parts and in more rural communities. It's like, I could be fine bringing this up, but this could go south. So let's let's just pretend that when you're saying I'm going home to my boyfriend, then I'll just chuckle along and say, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Again, that's all what we all do, right? When we come off here, we'll be popping home to our boyfriend straight away.
Yeah.
Jin, as a global majority person, what things have you noticed that aren't necessarily experienced by non-global majority people? You know, you and I in this audio room are the two global majority people, and our experience will be very different. But what have you noticed anything? And I know, just to interrupt myself there, I know that when we've talked about in previous recordings before, we've talked about race, and actually I think we had one discussion where you hadn't really noticed racism and that kind of thing so much, but actually when I think specifically with the George Floyd murder and Stop Asian Hate, your ideas really changed around that. So have you now come to notice it more so?
Well, yeah, because also you have to at that time when we did the podcast, that I was a student for a lot of time. I came to the UK when I was 17, but ever since I'm quite shielded under this umbrella of university. And my friends in my community, the mostly international students, so we don't really venture outside the university. I mean, maybe just me. My 20s is really plain. I don't really go out. I don't engage. I mean, I'm just really just in front of a computer and work and study. So, but now, I feel like I have a community and I'm actually start living in a way. Yeah, of course, it's we started this year with the Chinese New Year with the gunshot. Those things in the US, I noticed more. And now with gender equality and race equality, they are also closely linked. There's like long way statistics race play a big role. White and Asian women earn more than Black, Hispanic and Native women. And, coming back to health and pregnancy related issue, Black women face a higher risk of death from pregnancy related causes. Even with the pandemic, this thing, it keep coming up. So of course, with gender equality, when we consider race as a factor, it would improve the race equality at the same time as well. But at my workplace, there's no single Black woman that I know, like in the whole department, even in the whole business school, I know like one Black man. You can see that clear as a day that, so you needed to think about why don't we have these people in the department? Why is it? What are the reasons?
I've been trying to find a Black therapist. I was searching at the weekend for one, and the closest I can find to Newcastle was Edinburgh. That was interesting. And I think there was like Manchester. There's probably some others that I didn't find, but there was certainly, I've yet to find one in Newcastle, and no one can tell me if they've ever found one in Newcastle or the Northeast anyway, which speaks volumes. But I had never interacted with anyone from East Asia before until I met you. Not on obviously on a friendship level or more than a few sentences, because I know that with like East Asian community or particularly Chinese community, it's very sort of like closed off. And I was just wondering, from your own community and within your work, what have you now noticed since having this sort of, I guess, race awakening around understanding like racism a bit more, or not even racism, but like how differently you're treated? Is there anything that you've noticed that you probably didn't notice before with how you're treated, whether it's, the sort of Asian stereotype of, oh, you're good at economics, you're good at maths, even though you are good at maths? That's not necessarily because you're East Asian. Is there things that you've now kind of gone, oh, actually, that feels like a microaggression?
Yeah, I mean, especially the intersection with me also being gay was just it's not punished by death like Laura's field work, place, but it's frowned upon. Nobody talks about that. So the East Asian community, for example, from work, they're all Asian men with a family, and then the wife normally is a stay-home mom. It's just kind of stereotypical kind of a family. So it's difficult to connect with them. They probably find it difficult to connect with me, especially, one day I show up at work with undercut, and I don't even know if they want to introduce their kids to me. It's very, very different. I don't know how they perceive me, but we don't have that kinship. We don't have that kind of connection because I'm different, because my gay identity, and also not married, sort of thing. Even like Asian female at work, they normally would have a husband and 2 kids, and then things like that. So I become anomaly, basically.
Wow. Yeah. It's a really interesting one, because I definitely struggle with like finding Black women and non-binary people in those kind of positions at work anyway. But then to have that sort of intersection of what you said about like a queer or a gay or a non-binary identity, or not even identity, who you are. So at work, you wouldn't even consider talking about your family because they wouldn't even see who you talk about as family.
Yeah.
It would just be like, if you had a baby, they'd probably be like, they're just not interested.
Yeah. Even if I have a baby, then I'm not the standard kind of family type, that kind of, family. So I will be a single woman having a baby. And, they would be like not understanding, how did that happen? Where did get sperms? Things like that. It's just very... it's like Julie said before, like, when people they don't even know what the LGBT represents and what does that mean. It's kind of shocking because we are in this community, which I'm very grateful for. It's just shocking because that's all my feed. Social media feed is about.
You forget that there's people like that.
Outside my bubble, there's a whole wild world that it's this problematic word. So
definitely very problematic. It's not even just the community is so small. You just step out of it slightly and go, oh God, I want to go back. Let me back. Please don't let me out of this lovely echo chamber bubble. It's beautiful here.
It's beautiful here, yeah. We understand each other.
Exactly. You don't even have to speak about it. We just understand each other.
Yeah.
Julie, how do you think organisations should be working to fight gender equality, and do they do enough? Which I know is probably already going to be a no, but I will ask you anyway.
Yeah, it's a gift of a question. No. Next question.
Move on.
I think there's so much work to do because there's a general cluelessness still around gender and around including women, and most. I guess it stems. Most of our organisations and kind of institutions are based upon a really patriarchal and hierarchical model, where power relationships are masculinist in those. So things like, and expectations of what a leader is, for example, have all of these characteristics, conventional leadership, which are quite, are quite problematic if we don't open up what that is. Something that, these questions were making me think about before the conversation was like those feminist models of organizations and leadership, which we can get, which are based on kind of dismantling bias, of sharing power, working collaboratively, being self-reflective, and so forth. Like that, there are organizations trying to do that. So ActionAid, for example, is one lovely organization that's trying to, put those principles into action. And it seems so far away from, for example, universities that we've been talking about a little bit today, any kind of big hierarchical organization, because it would mean a really sort of root and branch reflection and kind of uprooting of the way that they work. So I think it's, they're not doing enough. They have to do an awful lot more even to begin to move in the right directions, really.
And again, that loss of power,
Yep.
or the illusion of the loss of power anyway.
Yep.
Because there would be no power loss except for the control element of it, the control that they want.
That's right. And absolutely. And that's why it's not advantageous to them to even explore some of these more radical things that we're talking about here.
Which shouldn't even be radical.
It shouldn't be. No, it's about having an equitable organisation and an equitable world. That ought not be radical. But the structures are so entrenched that I think it seems very difficult for people to be able to, for some people, to be able to even think what that might look like and to open up to it.
I really loved, I don't know if any of you have seen the Twitter account that trolls for people celebrating International Women's Day, like organisations, and then shows their gender pay gap and just like replies to them like, happy International Women's Day, but this is your gender pay gap. And it's so brilliant. It's an amazing Twitter feed, and if anyone out there hasn't seen it, I can't remember the name of it, but I reckon if you Googled like troll Twitter account gender pay gap, you'd probably find it. And if I do find it before we release this, I'll put it in the show notes. But it's beautiful because the hypocrisy of those organizations be like, happy International Women's Day, it's all great, it's all gravy, and then most of them have like the worst gender pay gap ever. I mean, some of them don't actually. Some of them are quite revealing that you think, oh, they're almost equal in terms of their pay gap, but some of them are astounding. And there were some in the Northeast, I was like, oh, okay. Some universities as well. Wow, that's embarrassing for you.
I mean, a lot of policy these days, because of union and because social media pressure, they take actions towards under the flag of to solve the gender inequality. For example, at Durham University, like they would say now encourage women in leadership role. So they for the leadership role, a director of research center or something, they would say at least one female should be in a leadership role. But then they don't consider that I feel like that's like a ticking a box. So in case some inquiry and say, what have you done? Oh, we done this. But then they don't think deeper. It's like when you have a male dominant department, and when you have only one female in that particular research group, and then that workload, it just unconditionally lays on the female that you have to take that role without the choice. And then that essentially would increase the workload of the female. And that doesn't help.
My friend told me something really interesting. She went to a meeting. It wasn't a meeting, actually. She was on some kind of board or something, and they were hiring a new person to come for a job. And my friend was the only woman that was part of the interview panel. And when they interviewed for the day and they were choosing who the people were, the best candidate was a woman. And every single man in that room chose the other candidate who was a man, who was not qualified. And she actually had to stand up and say, if you can't give me a reason as to why you're hiring this person, this man over this woman, who is clearly better, then you're going to have to justify it. And actually they ended up hiring the woman. But if she hadn't been there to do that, then that person, the deserving person who was a woman, would not have got that role. But it's horrible that my friend had to be put in that position to put herself up. And she said as soon as she closed I think they were on Zoom or something, as soon as she closed that, she said she burst into tears. Yeah. Because of the pressure that she was under to sit with all of these men. Yeah. Basically gaslighting her through it and being like, no, he was right, you're wrong. But then when she had to threaten them with, you'll probably get sued. Yeah. Then that's when they were like, okay. She was the best candidate. But the crying afterwards, the emotional labor that comes with that is just so much, because you have to be in that position where you are the mouthpiece and the spokesperson for everybody else that you want to bring along with you. But the amount of physical and emotional trauma that brings is just really intense. And putting one woman in a position to like you were saying, Jin, putting one woman in a position in a male-dominated space is, or anyone in a position where they are marginalized, is just so awful for them. And the labor and the baggage that you carry along with that as well, which is just awful. And I know that we've probably all had experiences of that, where we've been put in a position where we are kind of marginalized in some way. And can you use your voice? Some of us can, because maybe we're older or because we have had more experience, but a lot of people can't do that because there is actual real risk for them of losing their job.
Yeah, exactly. And also, like, there's an opportunity presented for you, and then if you turn it down, they'll be saying like, oh, you got the opportunity present for you, but you didn't want it. So it's like, damn I do, damn I don't, that sort of thing. It's just it's I don't find it like particularly useful for helping. So like I think that like women should be unified, like sort of in the US there's sort of some academic women mentor program, which I find really helpful. But those are normally targeted for early career researchers, who just graduate a PhD. So I think there should be a program like just target everybody who feels the need to apply, things like that mentorship.
Yeah, because you need mentoring throughout your life, really, which is something I'm realizing. I've never really had any mentorship before, but I've got someone now that's starting to mentor me, and it's like really important that that's there. I want to ask you, Laura, what impact do you think you've made within your work role, if any at all?
Good question. I mean, I'm not sure that I've had a massive impact yet, to be honest with you. Maybe check back in 5 years' time.
Not even on your extensive amount of field work?
Well, I guess I've rarely been in a position where sort of I've been able to take charge of, pots of money and that kind of thing in a way that I want to. I've definitely been involved in some great initiatives to promote all kinds of things, like, for instance, Our Ladies, which is a program, like our programming course tailored for women and non-binary people, although unfortunately that sort of shut down over COVID and hasn't quite come back. So I was briefly involved in that. And I was also involved in a project recently that looked at making fieldwork safer, looking at the experiences that people had during fieldwork. And we noted there was a lot of reporting of all kinds of things happening, but particularly for women, sort of episodes of harassment, sexual assault, that kind of things. And the work continues with colleagues at Newcastle University to look at policies across universities and other research institutions to see what they have in place and what could be improved upon to make fieldwork more accessible to people, because currently I think a lot of people are put off because they have bad experiences or they hear of bad experiences, and that's, that really saddens me, because I really love fieldwork and I think there's a lot to be gained from just going out into the field and measuring stuff and talking to people and that sort of thing. So yes, I guess
that sounds like impact to me.
Yeah, I guess to sum up, I'm not sure I've had a great impact yet, but I'm very much aware that I could have an impact, and that's something that I'd like to work towards.
And you have your queer science group as well.
Yeah. Got queer science group. That's true. These are all things that I'd like to sort of take more responsibility in, and sort of maybe work more on in the future.
Well, thank you. I've just got one more question left for all of you, which some of you might not be able to answer, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, but hopefully you can, because that's that on the spot moment. But Julie, are you aware of any schemes within your role or any that you've encountered that you would like to spread awareness of, mainly linked to combating or advising gender inequality? You did mention one before, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I think, well, I mentioned an organisation before, ActionAid, they're a big international global development organisation, and it's just that they try to operate by feminist principles and feminist models, which I think is fantastic. So it's not a scheme as such, but it's worth checking out on their website. They have like a 10-point thing of what a feminist organisation might look like and what they're trying to be, and that's global. I think the schemes that I'm aware of are kind of often in particular professions. So things for higher education, for example, there's an Aurora scheme which can help people develop kind of leadership. To be frank, it has some mixed reviews from from what people, I've never been on it, but from what people have said. But to help kind of women develop. And I guess I'm also just aware, because we were thinking about STEM today, some work I did with with an organisation recently. There's like a Women in Wind, and this is like, it's an offshore wind thing. Okay. And so I think these things are quite specialist, and if you're in that particular sector or profession, and you kind of dig around, hopefully there's something. But some professions, there just simply will not be. Quite often it can stem out of support through quite informal kind of like women's groups and things like that. I think that women in law and accountancy and that kind of thing, where you might be able to find some of that informal mentoring that you were actually just talking about. So I think it's often kind of quite sector specific, but not many are coming to off the top of my head. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, even if it's just organisations, you've given us more than enough there. Thank you. Jin, are you aware of any, I'll say organisations or schemes that you would like to shout about? If not, it does not matter at all.
I think it's just the top of my head, just the one I mentioned before. I think it's called the Women in Economics Initiative. Okay. There's a website of it, and then there's a mentoring program, which it's kind of new. It's the first round only happened last year, 2021 to 2022. And that's the first time they ever did that. And second round is now open. And then I find that mentoring program should be really useful. I'm hoping to sort of get them to expand it, not just for early career, recent PhD graduate, but also to, some middle-aged career person like me, because I still feel like I need a mentor.
I mean, you're not middle-aged, but okay. Middle career maybe, but definitely not middle-aged.
Yeah, and I think on their website, I mean, it's really nice to see that they include the non-binary, because in economics field, it is rarely word mentioned, but the goal they set on their website is like empower female non-binary economists by connecting them in a structured setting. So that's new, and then that's exciting.
That's great. That sounds like a really good initiative, and I hope that gets funding to continue, because that's the thing with these things. It relies on funding, and then they just kind of go, "Yeah, we've hit our diversity quota. Thanks.
Yeah,
no more funding." Laura, are you aware of any?
Yeah, there's a couple that I can shout out, and also just to touch back to that Twitter feed that you were talking about before, the gender pay gap bot is what it's called.
Oh, that's so simple. I don't know why I didn't remember that. Gender pay gap bot. Love that.
Yeah, exactly. It always gives me a laugh to see them. But yeah, so again, as Julie was saying, that the ones that I know of are fairly specific to the fields that I'm in or interested in. So the British Ecological Society has a mentoring scheme for women. I'm not sure how active it is at the moment. I think during lockdown it maybe went on the back burner a bit, but I'm not sure if it's restarted. And then there's Code First Girls, which is encouraging girls and women into programming and coding. So they offer courses, and I think, they're on a pay scale based on what you can afford, kind of thing. And just two more small ones. So it's not so much a formal group, but there is a support group for women and non-binary people, minoritized gender groups. There's a Facebook group called Women in the Field, which is very useful for getting advice and support for anyone that does field work. And then finally, I will just shout out Soapbox Science, which is an initiative to have women share the science that they do. And there's an event in Newcastle in July. And so they're at the moment looking for women and non-binary scientists who want to share their work on the street of Newcastle to sign up. So I think it's just soapboxscience.org. You can find out more there.
That sounds really great, and especially if it's going to be in Newcastle as well. That'll be
it's a global initiative, but they have sort of across cities, they put on these events, and they provide mentoring and help you get your work into a sort of format that can be distributed. But the whole idea is engaging with the public and promoting women and non-binary people in science. So it's about being role models and also building confidence in yourself.
Yeah, it's great that they're coming up here, because often Newcastle gets left out on the map in the northeast. So yeah, it's wonderful that they've kind of, whoever decided has made that decision. But thank you, all of you, for those recommendations, and just thank you for today. It's been really wonderful to speak to you all. And yeah, I hope one day, some of us haven't met in person. I mean, I've met you all, but some of you haven't met each other. So hopefully one day we'll get to do that, maybe at a Sister Shack event. But thank you all very much for taking the time out to record with me today. And I think that people will really get a lot out of this. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Dr. Julie Scanlon, Dr. Jinrui Pan, and Dr. Laura Braunhoultz. I really enjoyed sharing the audio space with these three wonderful humans, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Happy International Women's Day 2023.